The throne room of the Valkyrie Dominion stretched across an entire floor of the command citadel, a structure so large it had its own gravity. Pillars of dark metal rose from the floor like the bones of dead gods, and between them floated holographic maps of conquered star systems, over 400 of them, each one a trophy. Supreme Archon Kael'Voreth sat at the center of it all, his tall, gray-skinned frame draped in ceremonial armor that had not seen real battle in decades. He did not need to fight anymore. He had admirals for that. He had entire fleets for that. The Valkyrie Dominion had spent 3,000 years spreading across the galaxy, swallowing civilizations whole, and Kael'Voreth intended to keep that record perfect. Today, the War Council had gathered to discuss a small, blue world on the far edge of an unremarkable spiral arm, a world called Earth. "Show me," the Archon said, and the room obeyed. The holographic display shifted. Stars blurred and rearranged until a single solar system floated before the Council, one yellow star, 8 planets, and a scattering of moons and rocks. The third planet from the star glowed blue and green, wrapped in a thin layer of white clouds. "This is the Sol system," said General Mavic, a broad-shouldered officer with scars running down the left side of his face. "Our Long-Eye scouts first observed this world approximately 200 years ago. The dominant species calls itself human. At the time of observation, they were a Class II civilization, divided into many nations, still burning fossil fuels, using chemical rockets, and fighting wars among themselves with crude nuclear weapons." A few of the admirals around the table chuckled. Class II was barely worth noticing. Most species at that level had not even left their own planet yet. "They have no planetary shield," Mavic continued. "No orbital defense network. No energy weapons of any kind. Their fastest ships at the time of observation could not even reach the next planet in their system in less than several months." "So they are insects," said Admiral Dren, leaning back in his chair with a look of boredom. "Why are we discussing insects?" "Because the Sol system sits along a trade corridor we wish to expand," Mavic replied. "And Dominion law requires that all sentient species in our territory be formally subjugated. It is a matter of record." Kael'Voreth nodded slowly. Record mattered. Order mattered. Every species the Dominion had encountered in 3,000 years had been given the same choice: submit or be erased. 9,000 species had submitted. A handful had chosen the other option, and their worlds were now empty. "How many ships?" the Archon asked. Mavic did not hesitate. A standard subjugation armada should be more than sufficient. 4,800 warships, 3 Planet Cracker dreadnoughts as a precaution, 1.2 million ground forces for occupation after surrender. "That seems excessive for insects," Dren said. "It is protocol," Mavic replied. A voice rose from the far end of the table. It was quieter than the others, older, and carried the weight of someone who had spent a lifetime studying things that soldiers preferred to ignore. "If I may, Archon." The room turned. Archivist Selentha stood near the edge of the council circle. She was old even by Valkyrie standards, her gray skin faded almost to white, her eyes still sharp behind a face full of deep lines. She was not a soldier. She was the keeper of records, the one who studied every species before the Dominion consumed them. Most of the council tolerated her presence the way one tolerates a cautious elder at a feast, with polite impatience. "Speak," Kael'Voreth said. Selentha stepped forward and gestured at the holographic display of Earth. "I have reviewed every piece of data our Long-Eye scouts collected on this species, and I must note something that concerns me." "Concerns?" Admiral Dren raised a brow plate. "What could possibly concern us about a species that still fights with chemical explosions?" "Their speed," Selentha said simply. The room was quiet for a moment. "When we first observed them," she continued, "they had only just discovered powered flight machines that could carry them through their own atmosphere. Within 50 years of that discovery, They had built nuclear weapons capable of destroying their own cities. Within another 20 years, they had put members of their species on their own moon. She let that settle before going on. No species in our records has ever moved that fast. Not one. Most civilizations take thousands of years to go from atmospheric flight to basic space travel. The humans did it in a single lifetime. Their rate of technological growth is not just unusual, it is completely without precedent in the history of the Dominion. Admiral Dren waved a hand dismissively. And yet they are still Class 2. Speed means nothing if the destination is still primitive. That was 200 years ago, Selinta said, and her voice was calm but firm. We have not looked at them since. A brief silence filled the throne room. It lasted only a few seconds before Kael'Vorath broke it. 200 years is nothing, the Archon said. We have species in our records that spent 10,000 years at Class 2 before we arrived. The humans are fast learners, perhaps, but they are still children, and children must be taught their place in the order of things. He stood, and the room stood with him. Dispatch the 12th Subjugation Armada. Fleet Marshal Rin Talvex will command. Standard protocols. Give the humans their chance to surrender. If they refuse, reduce their world to glass and move on. The council bowed. Orders were given. Across the Dominion's military stations, 4,800 warships began powering their fold space drives. Ground troops loaded into transport carriers. 3 planet cracker dreadnoughts, each one large enough to be seen from a planet's surface, rumbled to life for the first time in decades. Fleet Marshal Rin Talvex received his orders aboard the flagship Inevitability, a warship that had led the conquest of 11 worlds. He was tall, sharp-featured, and carried himself with the relaxed confidence of someone who had never once faced an enemy he could not destroy. He read the briefing on the humans, smiled faintly, and set it aside. He had conquered species with far more impressive technology than chemical rockets. This would be routine. As the Armada assembled in formation above the throne world, Archivist Selinta stood alone in a viewing gallery, watching the ships blot out the stars one by one. The fleet was beautiful in its way, a perfect instrument of war, built by a civilization that had never known defeat. She pressed a hand against the cold glass and watched the last of the dreadnoughts slide into formation. 200 years, she thought. A species that went from first flight to nuclear weapons in 50 years had been left unwatched for 200. She whispered to the empty gallery, to no one at all. What have they become? The Armada folded into the darkness of space and was gone. The journey through fold space took 9 days. 9 days of silence and darkness as 4,800 warships traveled through the folded layers of the universe, crossing distances that light itself would need centuries to cover. Inside the flagship Inevitability, the crew went about their routines with the calm efficiency of professionals who had done this many times before. Fleet Marshal Rin Talvex spent most of the journey in his private quarters, reviewing old intelligence files on the target species. The data was thorough, as Dominion intelligence always was, but none of it impressed him. He flipped through images of human cities, dense, chaotic clusters of stone and glass. He studied their weapons, chemical-propelled projectiles, explosive warheads, clumsy rockets strapped to tubes of fuel. He watched recordings of their wars, which were numerous and brutal, and fought with a kind of savage energy that he found almost admirable in its primitiveness. They were a young species, aggressive, clever in their small ways, but hopelessly outmatched by anything the Dominion could bring to bear. Talvex had seen this story play out 11 times before. The target species would receive the subjugation decree, realize the hopelessness of resistance, and surrender. If they did not surrender, the planet crackers would fire, and the matter would be settled permanently. He closed the files and poured himself a drink. This assignment was beneath him, and he knew it, but orders were orders, and a clean conquest would look good in the records. 3 decks below the marshal's quarters, in the communications bay of the Inevitability. A young officer named Lieutenant Orth was not nearly as relaxed. Orth was small for a Valkyrie, with quick eyes and a mind that never stopped turning. Her job was to monitor long-range signal traffic during transit, a task that was usually dull and uneventful. Space, for the most part, was quiet. But the Sol system was not quiet. She had first noticed it on the second day of transit, when the Inevitability's long-range receivers began picking up faint electromagnetic emissions from the direction of their target. This was normal. Any civilization that used electricity would produce some background noise. Class II worlds typically generated a thin, scattered haze of signals, weak radio transmissions, crude television broadcasts, the occasional radar pulse. What Orth was receiving from the Sol system was not a haze, it was a flood. The electromagnetic spectrum was saturated. Layer upon layer of transmissions poured out of the system in every frequency band, radio, microwave, infrared, and others she could not immediately identify. The volume was enormous, far beyond anything a Class II civilization should produce. It was more signal traffic than some Class V worlds generated. She flagged it in her report and sent it to her superior, Senior Communications Officer Valak. Valak glanced at the data for approximately 4 seconds. "Solar interference," he said. "Yellow stars are noisy. Adjust your filters and stop wasting my time." Orth adjusted her filters. The signals did not go away. They got stronger. She said nothing more to Valak. Instead, she began quietly recording and cataloging everything she received. She ran translation algorithms on the signals, trying to find patterns, languages, anything recognizable. Most of it was encrypted in ways her software could not break, but some of it was open, broadcast signals, apparently meant to be heard by anyone. She managed to decode a fragment of what seemed to be a news broadcast. The language was strange, but the translation software did its best. The fragment described something called a Mars Colonial Authority, issuing new regulations for habitat construction. Another fragment mentioned a lunar economic zone and trade disputes between 2 human settlements on their moon. Orth stared at her screen. Settlements on their moon, colonies on the 4th planet. This was not a Class II civilization. This was not even close. She wanted to bring this to Talvex directly, but junior officers did not simply walk onto the Marshal's bridge. Protocol demanded she go through Valak, and Valak had already dismissed her once. So she kept recording, kept decoding, and kept a growing file of everything she found. On the 9th day, the Armada dropped out of fold space. They emerged at the edge of the Sol system, near the vast, cold cloud of ice and rock that surrounded it. Standard protocol called for a slow advance inward, a deliberate, visible approach designed to give the target species time to detect the fleet, understand what was coming, and begin to despair. Fear was a weapon the Dominion used as effectively as any gun. The fleet reformed into its standard invasion formation, dreadnoughts at the center, carriers and gunships fanning out in layered wings, supply ships trailing behind. 4,800 vessels moved as one, a wall of metal and fire drifting inward toward the small blue world at the heart of the system. Within the first hour, the sensor officers began reporting things that did not match the intelligence files. There were artificial objects everywhere. Thousands of satellites orbited Earth in dense, organized layers. More satellites circled the moon. Metallic structures, large ones, with clear energy signatures, sat on the lunar surface. The 4th planet, Mars, which the old intelligence files had described as a dead, empty rock, now showed clusters of energy readings consistent with powered settlements. Even some of the larger asteroids in the belt between the 4th and 5th planets showed signs of mining operations. Talvex was informed. He reviewed the sensor data with a slight frown but no real alarm. "They have been busy," he said. "It changes nothing. Insects that build taller hills are still insects." Then the probe arrived. It came from the inner system, accelerating at a speed that made the sensor officers check their instruments twice. A small, sleek object, no larger than a personal shuttle, crossing the vast distance between the inner planets and the outer system in hours. The fastest Dominion scout ships would have needed days to cover the same ground. The probe stopped at a precise distance from the fleet, close enough to scan, far enough to be out of weapons range. It hung in space, silent and still, for exactly 30 seconds. The sensor officers confirmed it was scanning them, every ship, every system, every weapon. Then it transmitted a message. The message was not in any human language. It was in perfect, flawless Valkyrie trade language, spoken with correct grammar and accurate pronunciation, as though the sender had studied their language for years. The words filled the bridge of the inevitability, and every officer present heard them clearly. Unidentified fleet, you have entered the sovereign territorial space of the United Earth Confederacy. State your intentions. You will not receive a second request. The bridge fell silent. Officers exchanged glances. The communications team verified the signal 3 times. It was real. It was coming from the probe, and it was, without question, in their own language. Talvik stood at the center of his bridge, hands clasped behind his back, staring at the small dot of light on his view screen that represented the human probe. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he laughed, a short, sharp sound that echoed off the metal walls. "They learned our language from old transmissions," he said. "Clever insects, but clever words do not stop dreadnoughts." He turned to his fleet communications officer. "No response. Continue advance. Standard formation. We will deliver the subjugation decree when we reach their world." The armada moved forward, deeper into the Sol system, toward the blue planet that waited in silence. In the communications bay, Orith listened to the human message again and again. She studied the probe's acceleration data. She looked at her growing file of decoded signals, the colonies, the encrypted military channels, the technology she could not yet understand. Something cold settled in her chest. It was not fear exactly. It was the feeling of standing at the edge of something vast and unknown and realizing, with terrible clarity, that every assumption she had been given was wrong. She began writing a formal report, addressed directly to the fleet marshal, bypassing Valak entirely. She knew it would likely get her disciplined. She did not care. She had to make someone listen before it was too late. The armada crossed the asteroid belt on the 3rd day of its inward advance, and that was when everything began to fall apart. Fleet Marshal Talvex had spent those 3 days in a state of calm irritation. The strange probe had returned to the inner system after delivering its warning, and no further contact had come from the humans. The silence bothered some of his officers, but Talvex read it as fear. A species that had nothing to fight with would naturally go quiet when faced with the largest invasion fleet in Dominion history. He ordered the standard subjugation decree broadcast on all frequencies as the fleet passed through the belt. The message was the same one the Dominion had used for 3,000 years, translated into every known human language by the ship's linguistic systems. It was simple and absolute. "People of Earth, you have been identified by the Valkyrie Dominion. Your world, your resources, and your species now fall under Dominion authority. You are ordered to disarm all military forces, surrender all leadership to Dominion administrators, and submit to species integration. Compliance will be rewarded with survival. Resistance will result in the complete destruction of your world. You have 1 planetary rotation to respond." The message went out. It echoed across the Sol system at the speed of light, bouncing off satellites and relay stations, and the hulls of human ships that the Dominion sensors were only now beginning to detect in the inner system. The response came in less than 10 minutes. It arrived on a tight beam transmission, directed precisely at the Inevitability's bridge communications array. A single voice, calm and measured, speaking in Valkyrie trade language with the same flawless accuracy as the probe's earlier warning. But this time, the voice carried something the probe had not: a weight, a quiet authority that made the air on the bridge feel heavier. "This is Admiral Sable Okonkwo of the United Earth Confederacy Combined Fleet. Your subjugation decree has been received and reviewed. We decline. You are hereby ordered to reverse course and leave the Sol system immediately. If you continue your advance, we will remove you. This is not a negotiation." Talvex listened to the message with his arms folded across his chest. A few of his officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but the marshal's expression did not change. "Remove us," he repeated as though tasting the words. A thin smile crossed his face. "Bold insects." He turned to his weapons commander. "Fire a demonstration volley, kinetic accelerator rounds, full spread. Target the space ahead of the fleet, let them see what is coming for them." The weapons commander obeyed. Across the armada, hundreds of warships opened their forward batteries and released a storm of kinetic rounds, dense metal projectiles accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed. It was not aimed at Earth directly. It was a show of force, a wall of destruction meant to prove that the Dominion's words were backed by power. The rounds screamed through space in perfect formation, thousands upon thousands of bright streaks tearing through the darkness toward the inner system. And then they were gone. Not deflected, not destroyed, not detonated, they simply ceased to exist. One moment the sensors tracked hundreds of thousands of projectiles moving at devastating speed. The next moment every single one of them vanished from every sensor on every ship simultaneously. No explosions, no debris, no energy signatures, nothing. The weapons commander stared at his console as though it had betrayed him. He ran diagnostics. He checked the data 3 times. His voice was very quiet when he finally spoke. "Marshal, the rounds are gone, all of them. I cannot explain how." The bridge was silent. Talvex's smile had disappeared. Across the fleet, sensor officers were reporting something else: brief, localized distortions in the fabric of space itself. Tiny gravitational anomalies, precise and controlled, appearing and vanishing along the exact trajectory the kinetic rounds had followed. Something had manipulated gravity at a level of precision the Dominion's best scientists considered theoretically impossible. Something had reached out and erased the volley from existence as casually as a hand brushing dust from a table. 3 decks below the bridge, Lieutenant Orith was running. Her formal report to the Marshal had been rejected by Valak, who had called her findings speculative and told her to return to her station. She had ignored him. She had taken her data pad, loaded with everything she had decoded over the past 12 days, and headed for the bridge. But she had also made a breakthrough that morning that had turned her concern into something close to terror. She had finally cracked one of the open-frequency transmissions from Earth, not a news broadcast this time, but an educational one. A lecture. A university-level course on something the humans casually called applied quantum gravity engineering. The lecture discussed the manipulation of gravitational fields at the subatomic level. It talked about folding space without fold drives. It described energy generation methods that drew power directly from the structure of the universe itself. It referenced these things not as theory, not as speculation, but as established technology tools that human students were expected to learn and use. Orith had studied advanced physics at the Dominion's finest academy. She understood, with cold certainty, what she was looking at. The humans were not just ahead of the Dominion. They were operating on a level of science that the Dominion had not even imagined was possible. The gap between them was not years or decades. It was something closer to an entirely different understanding of reality. She ran through the corridors of the inevitability, her data pad clutched to her chest, shoving past crew members and ignoring the shouts of officers who demanded to know why she was out of her station. She had to reach Talvex. She had to make him understand that this was not a conquest. This was not even a battle. This was a species that had climbed so far beyond the Dominion that fighting them was like throwing stones at a star. On the bridge, Talvex was making a decision that would seal the fate of every soul in his fleet. His pride was burning. He had conquered 11 worlds. He had never retreated. He had never failed. And he would not allow his legacy to include the words turned back by insects. "All ships full combat formation," he ordered. His voice was steady, controlled, and completely wrong. "Weapons free. All batteries target the inner system, and activate the primary weapon on the Dreadnought Absolute." The primary weapon, the planet Cracker, a gravity compression beam capable of shattering a world's crust and reducing its surface to molten slag. It was the Dominion's ultimate tool of destruction, used only when a species refused to submit and needed to be made an example of. The Dreadnought Absolute, the largest vessel in the fleet, began its firing sequence. Deep within its hull, reactors the size of small cities poured energy into a focusing array that would take several minutes to charge. When it fired, it would send a beam of compressed gravitational force across millions of kilometers, powerful enough to crack a planet in half. Across the fleet, every ship powered its weapons. Energy crackled along the hulls of destroyers and carriers. Missile bays opened. Fighter craft launched from their hangars in swarms. The Armada prepared for war against a world it did not understand. Orith reached the bridge access corridor. 2 guards stood at the entrance, and they stopped her immediately. "I need to see the Marshal," she said, breathing hard. "I have critical intelligence. The humans, they are not what we think they are. We have to stop. We have to stop right now." The guards looked at each other. One of them opened his mouth to respond. He never got the chance. Every light on the ship flickered. A low vibration passed through the hull, not from inside the ship but from outside, as though the universe itself had shifted slightly. Orith felt it in her bones, a sensation like standing at the edge of a cliff and feeling the ground begin to move. On the bridge, every screen, every console, every holographic display flashed once and then showed the same thing. The space ahead of the fleet, magnified 1,000 times, revealing what had been hidden until that moment. Something was coming, and it was already too late. The first thing that died was the silence. A sound passed through the inevitability that had no source any sensor could identify, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the metal bones of the ship and settled into the chests of every crew member aboard. It was not an attack. It was not a weapon. It was more like the universe clearing its throat. Then the systems began to go dark. It started with the weapons. Every gun battery on the inevitability shut down simultaneously, not damaged, not overloaded, simply switched off. The targeting computers went blank. The missile bays sealed themselves. The energy cannons along the ship's spine lost power and went cold. Within the same heartbeat, the same thing happened across the entire fleet. 4,800 warships. Every single one. Every weapon, every gun, every missile tube, every energy lance, all of them went dead at the exact same instant, as though a single hand had reached across the vastness of space and turned off every switch in every ship at the same time. On the bridge of the inevitability, alarms screamed. Officers shouted over each other, hammering at consoles that refused to respond. The weapons commander slammed his fist against his station and looked at Talvex with open confusion on his face. "Weapons are down, Marshal. All weapons. I cannot restart them. The systems are not damaged, they simply will not activate." Before Talvex could respond, the engines died. The inevitability's massive fold space drives, which could push the ship across light years, went silent. The sublight engines followed. The maneuvering thrusters cut out. The ship drifted, carried only by its existing momentum, suddenly as helpless as a stone thrown into a river. Reports flooded in from every ship in the fleet. The same story, repeated 4,800 times. Weapons offline, engines offline, shields collapsed, navigation frozen, communications between ships reduced to short-range emergency channels only. The Dreadnought Absolute, which had been charging its planet-cracking weapon, reported that its primary reactor had been shut down, not overloaded or destroyed, but gently and precisely powered down, as though someone had followed the correct shutdown procedure from inside the reactor room. Except no one had touched anything. The entire 12th Subjugation Armada, the most powerful military force the Valkyrie Dominion had ever assembled, was now drifting through space, completely powerless in the span of a few seconds. Talvik stood in the center of his bridge, surrounded by chaos, and for the first time in his career, he felt something he did not recognize. It was cold and heavy, and it sat in his stomach like a swallowed stone. Later, when he had time to think about it, he would realize it was fear. "How?" he said. His voice was quiet, nearly lost in the noise of alarms and shouting officers. "How is this possible?" No one answered him. No one could. Then the view screens lit up, and fear turned to something far worse. They appeared from everywhere and nowhere, folding into existence out of empty space with no warning, no energy signature, no transition. One moment the space around the Armada was empty. The next, it was filled with ships. Human ships. There were hundreds of them, arranged in a formation that surrounded the Valkyrie fleet on every side. They were smaller than Dominion warships, sleek and elegant, with smooth hulls that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. They did not look like weapons of war. They looked like something else entirely, like tools built by a species that had moved so far beyond war that their ships served a different purpose altogether. But the energy readings coming off those ships made every sensor officer on every Valkyrie vessel go pale. Each human ship radiated more power than a Dominion dreadnought. Some of them radiated more power than a small star. They had not used fold drives to arrive. The Dominion sensors would have detected fold space transitions. These ships had simply appeared, moved from one point in space to another instantly, without crossing the distance between. It was translocation, a technology the Dominion's greatest physicists had written off as mathematically impossible. Admiral Okonkwo's voice filled every bridge in the fleet. Not through the Valkyrie communication systems, those were dead. The voice came through the walls, through the air itself, as though the sound was being generated directly inside each ship by some means no one aboard could identify. Fleet Marshal Talvex, your weapons have been disabled. Your engines have been disabled. Your fleet is intact and your crews are unharmed. This is your final opportunity to stand down. Talvex looked at the hundreds of human ships surrounding his fleet. He looked at his dead consoles. He looked at the faces of his officers, and he saw the same thing on all of them, not anger, not determination, but a kind of helpless bewilderment, like children who had wandered into a place they did not understand. He opened his mouth. Perhaps he intended to surrender. Perhaps he intended to give one last defiant order. No one would ever know because he never got the chance to speak. Deep in the bowels of the Dreadnought Absolute, a reactor technician, panicking and acting without orders, had found a way to manually restart one of the secondary weapon systems. A single energy lance powered up and fired blindly into the formation of human ships. The shot struck one of the human vessels directly. It splashed harmlessly against its hull, absorbed like water into sand, doing nothing at all. But it was a shot fired, and that was enough. Admiral Okonkwo's voice returned. It carried no anger, no urgency, just a simple, factual statement like a teacher correcting a student's mistake. You were warned. What happened next took 11 seconds. It began at the edges of the fleet and moved inward with the precision of a surgeon's hand. The Valkyrie warships did not explode. They were not burned or crushed or torn apart by weapons fire. They were taken apart. Hull plating separated from frame structures and drifted away in neat, organized sheets. Reactors disconnected from power lines and went cold. Weapon systems detached from their mountings and folded into themselves until they were nothing but compact blocks of inert metal. Engines disassembled into their component parts, fuel cells here, thrust chambers there, control systems in a third pile, all floating in perfect, organized silence. Ship after ship after ship, the Valkyrie fleet dissolved like a sand castle in rising water, not destroyed, disassembled, every bolt, every wire, every plate and pipe and panel separated with a care and precision that was almost gentle. The dreadnoughts went last. The Absolute, the largest warship the Dominion had ever built, a vessel that could crack a planet, came apart in layers, like the petals of a flower opening. Its planet-cracking weapon was removed from its housing, its energy safely dispersed, its components arranged in a floating grid that looked almost like a museum display. By the 11th second, the 12th Subjugation Armada had ceased to exist as a fleet. In its place floated a vast, silent cloud of neatly organized ship components, spread across thousands of kilometers of space. And among those components floating in the darkness were the crew. Every single Valkyrie, all 1.2 million of them, was alive. Each one was enclosed in a bubble of soft, warm light that held breathable atmosphere, maintained comfortable temperature, and kept them in a state of gentle unconsciousness. The bubbles drifted among the wreckage like seeds on a quiet wind, each one carrying a sleeping soldier who had no idea that the most powerful fleet in galactic history had just been erased around them. Not one of them had been harmed. Not one had been burned or cut or bruised. Not one had even been allowed to feel pain. Lieutenant Orith was among them. She had been standing in the corridor outside the bridge when the disassembly began, and she had felt a moment of warmth, a gentle pressure, and then nothing. She woke inside her bubble an unknown time later, floating in space, surrounded by silence and drifting metal. She looked around. She saw the remains of the inevitability, not wreckage but components, laid out in orderly rows as though waiting to be catalogued. She saw thousands of other bubbles, each glowing softly, each holding one of her fellow soldiers. She saw a ship approaching. It was human, small, white, marked with a symbol she did not recognize, a red cross on a white background. A voice reached her through the bubble. It was human, speaking in Valkyrie trade language, and it was the kindest sound she had ever heard. "Easy now. You are safe. We are going to bring you inside and make sure you are well. Just breathe. Everything is going to be all right." Orith floated in her bubble of light and stared at the empty space, where the mightiest fleet in the galaxy had been. 11 seconds, she thought. They had done it in 11 seconds. And they had not killed a single one of us. The survivors returned to the throne world 6 weeks later, carried in their own shuttlecraft, which the humans had found among the disassembled fleet components, reassembled with perfect accuracy, fueled, stocked with food and water, and pointed toward home. There had been no demands, no conditions, no treaties forced upon them at the point of a gun. The humans had simply repaired the shuttles, loaded the sleeping Valkyrie inside, woken them gently, explained what had happened, and sent them on their way. The medical ships had stayed with them for the first 2 days of the journey, making sure everyone was healthy, treating minor injuries that some crew members had sustained before the disassembly, old bruises, a broken wrist from a fall during the chaos, one officer's chronic back pain that the human doctors had fixed almost as an afterthought with a device that looked like a pen. Then the human ships had turned around and gone home, leaving the Valkyrie shuttles to make the long journey back to Dominion space alone. When the first shuttles arrived at the throne world, the Dominion did not know what to do with them. The War Council assembled in emergency session. The throne room, which had felt so powerful and permanent the day the Armada departed, now felt hollow. The holographic maps of conquered star systems still floated between the pillars, But the admirals who sat beneath them could not stop glancing at those maps and thinking about what they now knew, that somewhere in one unremarkable spiral arm, there was a species that could have torn every one of those systems away from the Dominion without effort. The military commanders argued for 3 days. Some wanted to send another fleet, 10 fleets, 100 fleets, every ship the Dominion possessed. They spoke of honor and pride and the need to answer this humiliation with overwhelming force. They pounded tables and raised their voices and refused to accept what had happened. Others sat in silence, staring at nothing, trying to process a reality that had no place in their understanding of the universe. The Valkyrie Dominion had been the supreme power in the galaxy for 3,000 years. They had conquered 9,000 species. They had never been defeated. The concept of losing was so foreign to their culture that their language did not even have a proper word for it. And now they had not just lost, they had been made irrelevant, a child swinging a stick at an ocean. Archon Kael'Vorath sat on his throne through all of it, listening, saying nothing. His face betrayed nothing, but those who knew him well could see the change. The casual confidence was gone. The easy authority that came from ruling an undefeated empire had cracked, and what showed through the cracks was something old and raw and very close to despair. On the 4th day, he summoned Archivist Selindha. She came alone, carrying no documents, no data pads. She did not need them. She had spent the past 6 weeks doing nothing but studying every piece of information the survivors had brought back, and she carried it all in her mind. "Tell me," the Archon said. The throne room was empty except for the 2 of them. His voice echoed off the pillars. Selindha stood before him and spoke plainly. 200 years ago, the humans had just begun to leave their own planet. They were clever but limited, trapped by the same physical laws that every young species struggles with: the speed of light, the energy problem, the distance between stars. By every model we have, they should have needed at least another 1,000 years to reach Class 4 status, perhaps 2,000 to reach Class 5. She paused. They reached Class 5 in approximately 80 years, and then they kept going. They did not slow down. They did not plateau. They passed through every classification level we have in less than 2 centuries, and then they moved into territory where our classifications no longer apply. Kael'Vorath stared at her. "How?" "I do not fully know," Selindha said, "but from what Lieutenant Orith decoded from their open transmissions, and from what the survivors observed during their time in human custody, I can tell you this: they solved the fundamental problems of physics. Not in the way we have, by building bigger machines and more powerful reactors. They changed their understanding of reality itself. They found principles beneath the ones we know, deeper laws that govern the structure of space and time. And once they understood those laws, everything else followed. Energy, gravity, matter. They can manipulate all of it the way we manipulate simple tools." "The fleet," the Archon said, 4,800 ships, they dismantled them in seconds." "Yes." "And killed no one. Not a single soul. Every crew member was individually contained, life-supported, and kept unconscious during the disassembly. The precision required to do that, to take apart thousands of warships at the atomic level while simultaneously protecting every living being inside them, is beyond anything I can describe with our mathematics." The Archon was quiet for a long time. The holographic star maps turned slowly above them, casting pale light across the floor. "Could they destroy us?" he asked. "The throne world, the Dominion, all of it?" Selindha did not hesitate. "Yes, at any time, without difficulty. They could have done it the moment our fleet entered their system. They could probably do it from where they are now, across the entire galaxy, without sending a single ship." "Then why didn't they?" "Because they chose not to." Kael'Vorath leaned forward on his throne. "That is not an answer. Every species we have ever encountered has used its power when it had the advantage. Every single one. It is the nature of intelligent life. The strong consume the weak. We have built our entire civilization on that truth. Selindha looked at him with her old, sharp eyes, and for the first time in the long decades of her service, she allowed herself to speak to the Archon not as a subordinate but as an equal. Perhaps, she said, that truth was never as true as we believed. Perhaps we simply never met a species strong enough to prove it wrong. The Archon had no answer for that. 3 weeks later, a single ship appeared at the edge of Dominion space. It was small, unarmed, and it broadcast its identity and intentions openly on all channels. It was a diplomatic vessel from the United Earth Confederacy, requesting permission to approach the throne world. The War Council debated for 2 days about whether to allow it. In the end, curiosity and the unspoken knowledge that refusing would make no difference if the humans truly wished to come, won out. The ship landed on the throne world's primary diplomatic platform, a vast stone terrace that had hosted the surrender of dozens of conquered species over the centuries. A full honor guard of Valkyrie soldiers lined the walkway, armed and armored, though every one of them understood the weapons were meaningless. The ship's door opened, and a single human stepped out. She was not what they had expected. She was neither tall nor physically imposing. She appeared to be in the middle years of human life, with dark brown skin, close-cropped gray hair, and calm, warm eyes that seemed to take in everything around her with genuine interest rather than judgment. She wore simple clothing, no armor, no ceremonial dress, no visible technology of any kind. Her name was Dr. Amara Yell, and she was the United Earth Confederacy's ambassador to First Contact civilizations. She walked the length of the honor guard alone, unarmed, unguarded, smiling slightly at the soldiers she passed as though she were walking through a garden rather than the heart of an empire that had tried to enslave her species. She was brought to the throne room where the full War Council waited. Archon Kael'Vorath sat on his throne. Selindha stood nearby. Lieutenant Orith, who had been quietly promoted after her intelligence efforts were finally recognized, watched from the observer's gallery. Dr. Yell stood before the Archon and bowed, not deeply, not submissively, but with the polite respect of one equal greeting another. "Thank you for receiving me," she said in flawless Valkyrie. "I will not take much of your time." She carried no treaty. She presented no list of demands. She made no mention of reparations, territory, or punishment for the attempted invasion. Instead, she extended an invitation. Earth was hosting a galactic cooperative summit, an open gathering for any species that wished to attend. The purpose was simple: to share knowledge. Medicine, energy production, materials science, agricultural technology, physics, mathematics, all of it, freely given, with no conditions and no cost. Humanity had learned things during its rapid climb that could benefit every civilization in the galaxy, and they wished to offer those things to anyone willing to receive them. The Valkyrie were invited, not as conquered subjects, not as enemies being offered terms, as guests. The War Council sat in stunned silence. Admiral Dren, who had called the humans insects in this very room, looked as though someone had struck him across the face. Other admirals shifted in their seats, unable to reconcile what they were hearing with everything they understood about how power worked. Kael'Vorath spoke. His voice was careful, measured, stripped of its old arrogance. "Why?" he asked. "We sent a fleet to enslave your world. We aimed a weapon at your planet that would have killed billions of your people. Why would you offer us anything but destruction in return?" Dr. Yell looked at him for a long moment. Her expression was not angry, not triumphant, not pitying. It was something simpler and harder to define, a deep, steady warmth, like sunlight through a window. "Because we remember what it was like to be afraid of the dark," she said. "We remember what it was like to be small and alone and surrounded by things we did not understand. We spent most of our history afraid of each other, of the universe, of everything. And when we finally climbed high enough to see clearly, we made a choice." She paused and looked around the throne room at the pillars, the holographic maps, the silent admirals. We did not climb this high to stand alone. The throne room was quiet. No one spoke, no one moved. Dr. Yell smiled once more, bowed again, and left the way she had come. A single, unarmed woman walking calmly through the heart of an empire, leaving behind her an invitation that would change the course of galactic history. In the observer's gallery, Lieutenant Orith watched her go. She thought about the bubbles of light that had held her safely while the fleet dissolved around her. She thought about the human medic's voice, gentle and kind, telling her she was safe. She thought about a species that had gained the power to destroy anything and had chosen instead to protect everything. In her quarters that night, Archivist Selendha opened a new file in the Dominion's Great Record, the archive that held the history of every species the Valkyrie had ever encountered. For 3,000 years, every entry in that record had been a story of conquest. A species discovered, a species defeated, a species absorbed. This entry would be different. She sat in the quiet glow of her writing screen, thought for a long time, and then typed the title. She called it The Species That Chose Mercy. It was the first entry in the Great Record that was not a story of conquest. She suspected, as she began to write, that it would not be the last.